In Silver Lake, a small town in Oregon, a gray town. In a place where the streetlights barely illuminate the uneven sidewalks, John found shelter in the openings of old, forgotten buildings. At 48, looking even older, his life was a jumble of cold days and even colder nights. All the hope he carried in his dreams dissipating like the steam on his breath on winter mornings. His hair was thinning and his eyes, which had once been lively and curious, now reflected a sea of resignation. Dressed in a threadbare coat he'd found in a dumpster, and equally worn pants, John cringed under the weight of the world. On one of these evenings, he was sitting under the marquee of an old bookshop, his thoughts lost between hunger and tiredness. It was a sad day, even more so than the others. It was 20 years since the event that had completely changed his life. He found himself in the midst of turbulent thoughts going over his past when he heard footsteps approaching. He stopped for a moment, not paying much attention. It was common for people to walk past him, ignoring him as if he were part of the urban scene. However, the footsteps stopped, and a soft voice asked, "Are you all right?" Surprised, John looked up and met the eyes of a middle-aged woman, her golden hair falling softly over her shoulders, and she wore an expression of genuine concern. She was wearing an elegant overcoat, in stark contrast to John's reality. "As you can see, I look wonderful." John's voice came out more bitter than he had intended. He didn't mean to be rude, but somehow he couldn't help it. "There's no need to be sarcastic. I can see that things aren't easy." She crouched down beside him, her gaze never straying from his. "What's your name?" "John."
I'm sorry.
"And yours?" "My name is Clara." She held out a bag for him. "I've brought you some food. Would you like some?" Hesitant, but unable to deny his hunger, John accepted the bag, his trembling fingers briefly touching hers. Opening it, he found a sandwich and a small bottle of juice. "Thank you," he murmured, his low voice laden with a strange mixture of gratitude and shame. "You're welcome, John." Clara sat down next to him, ignoring the dirt. "Tell me, how did you end up here?" The question made John swallow. To talk about his life was to relive every wrong choice, every moment of despair. But there was something about Clara, perhaps the way she looked him straight in the eye, that made him want to talk. It had been a long time since he had spoken openly to anyone. "It's a long story," he began, his voice a shaky whisper. "I lost my job, my house, my family. There wasn't much left. Drink became my only refuge." "I'm sorry to hear that, John." Clara's voice was soft, but it carried a firmness that seemed to pull the words out of him. "But you know it doesn't have to be the end, right? You can still change your story." Her assertiveness took him by surprise. No one had ever said something like that to him. Something that sounded so simple and yet so distant. "Change my story?" John laughed humorlessly. "It doesn't seem so simple when you have nothing." "Maybe, but it all starts with a decision, John. The decision to try." Clara's words echoed in John's mind like a whisper in an empty chamber. He lowered his head, gazing at the sandwich in his trembling hands, wondering if there was the strength within him to make such a choice. "Right. I'd rather not. Thank you," he replied, turning away. Clara, unable to understand his refusal but accepting it, left. That night, John was taken back to the bleak winter of 2004, 20 years before that very day. From a wealthy family, John had experienced ups and downs during his teenage years. He was a below-average student, but excelled in wrestling. He could even have pursued a career, but while still at school, due to his weak spirit and not so assertive upbringing, he gave himself over to drugs, cigarettes, and drink gradually undermined his sporting performance, and with this they came to occupy an important place in his life. He left home early and attended the University of Oregon in Eugene for a few semesters. But what seemed like it would lead to a stable career in the future ended up meeting a new and relentless addiction: gambling. At first they were more of a distraction from university life, but little by little it escalated so that he could no longer control himself. And the money that was coming in to pay for college ended up being used to satisfy that uncontrollable desire to gamble. He returned home to his parents devastated, and because of the humiliation decided to accept treatment. After a few months in hospital, he finally came out, believing that things would be simpler from then on. In a way, it was for a while. He found a job that paid well, thanks to his father's good contacts, and began to build a career that seemed to be solid. That same year he met Clarice, with whom he soon began dating, and just 2 years later the couple's son, Cowan, was born. Life now seemed prosperous and free of all the ailments that had afflicted him during his teenage years. But then his parents were suddenly struck down with a serious illness, and both died almost on the same day. The doctors were never able to explain what had happened to them. Although he had received a huge inheritance that would have allowed him to give up work, he found himself even deeper into his work as a way of trying to forget the tragedy. His wife, worried about John's state of mind and his uncontrollable eagerness to work, arranged a trip for them, gave John only a week's notice and, with great difficulty, managed to convince him to go on vacation. He reluctantly agreed. Those 2 weeks were wonderful. John for the first time disconnected from the corporate world and was able to enjoy his growing son. He realized that he didn't have to keep himself totally busy at work, and he came back determined to quit his job and go and enjoy his family. On his way back from vacation, a driver who was worried about his family and the bills that were coming due swerved into the opposite lane, didn't see the car coming towards him. It was Sunday night, and John tried to swerve, throwing the car over the cliff. His wife and son died instantly. John spent many months in hospital, enduring the darkest period of his life. He woke up sweating in the cold, his hands shaking with hatred, and he punched the floor countless times until he began to cry. He realized that he was actually afraid to try again. He had failed before and lost everything he had achieved. He didn't want that to happen again. She spent the next few days hiding from any human contact. She didn't want to see anyone. She felt very angry with everyone. He wandered around the city almost aimlessly. Desperate and bewildered, he finally decided to stop. It was late at night when he sat down on an empty bench in the square. "What if I told you I could help you start again?" Clara spoke, breaking the silence. John's eyes widened, and he looked back frightened. "Please, leave me. You don't have to put up with this anymore, John. Nobody has to live like this. You don't know anything about me. Who do you think you are? You're right," Clara replied. I don't know anything about you. But I do know about me, and I know I can help you. I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help. He replied, nervously. John, who are you? John fell silent, thinking that question had stirred him. For the first time he stopped and realized that he no longer knew who he was. I don't know. He answered bitterly, holding back tears. Clara remained silent, sat down next to him, and waited calmly until John began to vent. After the accident, the first time I opened my eyes, I expected to see my son and my wife next to me, but they weren't there. I called a nurse, and with great difficulty I managed to ask her where they were. She looked at me frightened. She didn't want to answer. I despaired, until they told me the truth. It had been 3 months since the accident. I had lost all movement as a result of the blow and the fall, but I had escaped. They hadn't. I cried a lot that night, alone, wondering why God had delivered me and taken them. I had lost my parents, my loves. I had nothing left. When I got out of hospital, I didn't know where else to go. I didn't have the courage to go home, or to face the situation head-on. It completely destroyed me. It was in drink and gambling that I found refuge. I was out of control. I lost everything my parents left me. I spent every last penny in less than a year, and when it was all over, I was wandering around. No, I can't go back. It's too late to start again. Clara smiled, her expression both promising and mysterious. Let's talk about it after you've eaten. You need strength? Clara took some sandwiches out of her bag. After days of not eating, John felt each bite as a small step towards an unknown abyss. Clara waited patiently by his side, like a beacon in a storm. After finishing the improvised meal, John felt a little stronger, the energy of the simple but nutritious food giving him a glimpse of vitality that he hadn't experienced for a long time. Clara watched him with a thoughtful expression, as if she were assessing the best way forward in the conversation. John, what I'm about to propose may seem a little unusual. Clara began, choosing her words carefully. I work for an organization that helps people in difficult situations restart their lives, not just with food or a place to sleep, but by offering a new purpose, a new direction. John looked at Clara in disbelief. The idea that someone would be willing to offer more than temporary assistance seemed like a distant dream. His skepticism, however, was palpable, a wall erected by years of disappointment. And what exactly would this organization do for me? He asked, his voice tinged with a caution hardened by life on the streets. Clara took a deep breath before answering, as if preparing the ground for something great. We offer you an education, a kind of training, not just educational, but also psychological and emotional. We help people rediscover themselves, discover new passions and skills. And, eventually, we help you find a stable job. John frowned, beyond suspicion, not knowing if he wanted that. I understand your hesitation, I really do. Clara lightly touched John's arm, a gesture of solidarity. But I assure you, our organization has been changing lives for years. All we ask in return is commitment and the will to change. Do you have that will, John? John looked at his own reflection in a puddle of water next to the bench. His distorted image seemed to symbolize the internal confusion he felt. On the one hand, Clara's offer was the lifeline he secretly craved. On the other, the fear of giving in to another disappointment kept him cautious. Why would you do that for me? He asked, looking straight into Clara's eyes. Why help a stranger like me? Clara smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the night around her. Because someone did the same for me, years ago. Her voice was soft, but carried a quiet strength. I was lost, without direction, until someone reached out to me. Now it's my turn to do the same. The silence that followed was full of meaning. John pondered Clara's words, the weight of his decision shaping his future in ways he could barely begin to comprehend. And if I say yes, what happens now? John's voice was hesitant, but behind it, there was a spark of hope. Now, we begin your transformation process. I'll take you to our training center early tomorrow morning. There, you'll meet the team and begin your journey. John nodded slowly, his mind still turbulent with doubts and fears, but the desire to escape the cycle of hopelessness in which he was trapped was beginning to take shape. He looked at Clara, now not just as a stranger, but as the messenger of a new life. Underscore, what if I give up? Underscore, you're free to do what you think is best for you. We'll give you other options, but if you don't want to, that's fine. That's fine. I accept. Clara smiled again, joy and relief mixed in her expression. Excellent. Rest today. Tomorrow will be the first day of the rest of your life. As Clara stood up, holding out her hand to help John do the same, he felt the weight of the world begin to lift from his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, he really could change his story. The night that followed was the longest of all for John. Lying on the cold floor of the same marquee where he had first met Clara, he gazed up at the dim stars in the cloudy, snowy city sky, allowing himself to dream, something he hadn't done for years. The cold no longer seemed so biting, nor the loneliness so oppressive. For the first time in a long time, there was a spark of hope burning inside him. At the crack of dawn, Clara was there, punctual as promised. She arrived in a small car, somewhat discreet and not very new, but well cared for. John, with what little he owned packed into an old, torn rucksack, felt like a stranger when he got into the vehicle. The feeling of being in a clean and orderly environment was almost surreal. Good morning, John. Did you sleep well? Clara asked, as she drove through the still quiet morning streets. Well enough, all things considered. John replied, his voice still rough from sleep and emotion. Today is a great day, Clara said, with an encouraging tone. Are you ready to start your journey? I think so, John said, trying to infuse more confidence into his words than he actually felt. The training center was a modern building, located in a part of the city that John rarely visited. Clara led him through bright corridors to a cozy office, where they were greeted by a middle-aged man with a warm smile and intelligent eyes. John, this is Marco, our coordinator. Clara introduced him. He'll help you with everything you need. Welcome, John. We're really happy to have you with us. Marco held out his hand, which John shook, feeling a firmness that somehow conveyed security. Thank you. I'm grateful for this chance, John said, meeting Marco's eyes. Great. Let's start with some basic assessments, to better understand how we can help you.
Marco explained.
Don't worry, it's just standard procedure for everyone who arrives here. John spent the next few hours being assessed on different aspects: physical health, educational skills, psychological state. It was exhausting, but every person he interacted with at the center treated him with a dignity that he had forgotten he deserved for almost 2 decades. After the assessments, he was taken to a small classroom, where a small group of other people who also seemed to be starting their journeys awaited him. Clara left him with an encouraging smile. I'll leave you here. Marco and his team will take care of everything. Remember, John, every step you take here is a step towards rebuilding your life. We're all rooting for you. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity for John. He spent his days between therapy sessions, professional training classes, and workshops on financial management and personal health. Each day was structured to build not only skills, but also the confidence John so desperately needed. Despite his initial enthusiasm, it wasn't all plain sailing. Some nights, John found himself awake, fighting the shadows of the past that insisted on invading his thoughts. The fear of failure, the shame of his past, and the uncertainty about the future sometimes seemed overwhelming. The fact of continuing his life also seemed to weigh him down. He thought he was wrong to want to prosper in the face of past tragedy. On one of those difficult nights, Marco found him alone in the center's small garden, looking up at the starry sky. Are you all right, John? Marco asked, sitting down next to him on the cold bench. I'm trying, but it's hard. Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve to be here, John confided, the words laden with a weight he rarely shared. Marco listened attentively, nodding slightly. John, everyone here has their struggles, their ghosts. But remember, you were chosen to be here because we saw something in you. A strength, a will to change. And that counts for much more than any past. I just don't want to disappoint or lose anyone, John said, looking down at his trembling hands. And you won't, Marco said with conviction. Every step you take here is a victory. And even if you stumble, we're here to help you up. As the program progressed, John also began to make friends among the other participants. There was Lucia, a young woman struggling with drug addiction, and Tomas, an ex-military man who was trying to adapt to civilian life after a war trauma had driven him onto the streets. Together, they formed a small support group, sharing experiences and encouragement. As the end of the program approached, John felt transformed. He had not only acquired new skills, but also a new sense of identity and purpose. Clara often visited the center to follow his progress, and each meeting was a celebration of John's small achievements. "John, you've done an incredible job," Clara said on one of these visits, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm so proud to see how much you've grown. I couldn't have done it without the help of everyone here," John replied, sincerely grateful. "You rescued me and changed my life, Clara. You really did. And now you're ready for the next step?" Clara smiled. "We're organizing a job fair here in the center next week. Several companies will be there, looking for talents like you. It's your chance to start afresh, on your own terms." John nodded. The idea of re-entering the world of work was both frightening and exciting. He was ready, however, to face this new challenge, armed with new skills and a new outlook on life. The job fair was a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The training center had been transformed, with stands from various companies set up in the large auditorium, and participants from various programs circulating, CVs in hand. John, now no longer recognizable in the mirror, his beard done and hair cut, wearing a clean shirt and pants that Clara had given him, felt a chill in his stomach. It was as if he was about to take the biggest step of his life. He approached the first stand, a construction company that was looking for workers for a new project. The recruiter, a tall man with a serious countenance, looked at John's CV and then at him. "I see you have quite a gap in your work history. Can you explain that to me?" the recruiter asked, his voice neutral. John swallowed, a wave of fear passing through him. He remembered Marco's words, "Be honest about your past, but focus on what you've learned and how you've changed." "I've had a difficult few years, facing serious personal problems. But I'm motivated to get back into the job market and demonstrate my commitment and ability," John explained, trying to convey both the sincerity and confidence he felt. The recruiter nodded, looking at John with new interest. "Interesting. And what would these new skills be?" he asked. John detailed the certifications he had received and the practical projects he had worked on during the program, talking enthusiastically about each new skill he had developed. The recruiter seemed increasingly impressed. "Well done, John. Let's have a formal interview next week. Here's my card. Please call to make an appointment." The man held out a business card to John. John accepted the card with trembling hands. "Thank you. I won't let you down," John said, gratitude evident in his voice. He continued to browse other stands, each conversation boosting his confidence. Some companies showed interest, others didn't, but every interaction was a lesson learned. At the end of the day, exhausted but exhilarated, John ran into Clara, who was watching from afar. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. I think I did well. I've got some interviews lined up." John couldn't help but smile, a smile that lit up his whole face. "I knew you could do it," Clara said, hugging him briefly. "You're one of the most inspiring success stories we've had here, John." That night, as he prepared for bed in the small room the center had temporarily provided for him, John reflected on his journey. From a man without hope, living on the streets, to someone with a promising future and a fresh start. It wasn't just a change of circumstances, it was a transformation of his whole outlook on life. The week leading up to the interview was one of the longest and most anxious for John. He devoted every spare moment to preparation, reviewing notes from the training program, practicing answers with Tomas and Lucia, and even attending personal development workshops offered by the center. His determination to make this opportunity count was palpable. The day of the interview arrived and, wearing the only dress shirt he owned and the pants Clara had given him, John felt a strange mixture of nervousness and preparation. He arrived early, had a coffee in a small cafe near the construction company, and went over his main points one more time before heading to the building. On entering the interview room, John was greeted by the same recruiter from the job fair and a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as the company's HR manager. The interview was intense, with a series of questions about his skills, his previous experience, and his expectations for the future in the company. John, although nervous, answered with honesty and a remarkable sense of clarity. He talked about the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and how these experiences had shaped him into a stronger, more resilient person. With each answer, he felt his confidence growing. "Thank you, John," the HR manager said at the end of the interview, giving him an encouraging smile. "We appreciate your transparency and the obvious effort you put into your rehabilitation and training. We'll deliberate and get back to you shortly." Leaving the building, John felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He had done his best, and now all he could do was wait. 2 weeks later, Clara, walking through the streets of Silver Lake, ran into John, who was again sitting under that same marquee. What is it, John? What's wrong with you? Clara shouted at him, worried. John smiled at her and said, I passed, Clara. I got the job. I start tomorrow. John stayed with the company for almost a decade, until he opened his own business, converting 25% of his profits into helping people overcome gambling addiction. Today he travels all over America giving talks. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.